It was described Wednesday as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Trump playing nice in Mexico City in a private meeting with President Enrique Pena Nieto before flying north of the border to Arizona, where he confirmed his wall-building intentions in a major speech on immigration. Trump is trailing in the polls, with dismal numbers among Latinos and most other immigrant communities. This in a nation, the United States, whose success is built on waves of new arrivals from elsewhere. Trump is trailing, but he's not out. In fact, he's making up ground, according to some surveys. We'll ask why, and why his message is resonating beyond U.S. borders. Last week, the Republican nominee campaigned in Mississippi alongside UKIP's Nigel Farage. Is his campaign a one-off or the new face of those who reject open borders and globalization? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at build-a-wall politics, and joining us, international New York Times columnist Celestine Bolen. Welcome back.
Thank you.
From Mexico City, John Ackerman, academic, columnist, and editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review. Welcome back to the show.
François, great to be with you.
From Brussels, Bruno Gollnisch, member of the European Parliament for the French National Front Party.
Good evening.
And from Boston, Yascha Mounk, who lectures on political science at Harvard University and a fellow at the Transatlantic Academy. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Let's begin with a game of Spot the Difference. Donald Trump, Wednesday in Mexico City.
And I happen to have a tremendous feeling for Mexican Americans, and they are amazing people, amazing people.
And then later in the day in Phoenix, Arizona.
Begin working on an impenetrable, physical, tall, powerful, beautiful southern border wall. And Mexico will pay for the wall. They don't know it yet, but they're going to pay for the wall.
John Ackerman, a lot of eyebrows were raised when Mexico's president invited both U.S. candidates to come to Mexico. Were you expecting this scenario to stick to script in this way?
Well, unfortunately, I kind of was. A lot of people were surprised by the fact that, the Mexican president wouldn't defend the Mexican people against these xenophobic and racist attacks by Donald Trump. But actually, those of us who've been following politics for a while realize that Enrique Pena Nieto, our president, is actually just as anti-Mexican as Donald Trump himself.
You're saying anti-Mexican. He handled Trump with kid gloves, and he's being roasted for it in the Mexican press this Thursday. His office has come out today with a statement saying that Trump's remarks in Phoenix were outrageous.
Yeah, right. Well, that's a little bit late. Enrique Pena Nieto, let's look at the facts, but beyond what they say, Enrique Pena Nieto is already applying in Mexico Trump's immigration policies. Mexico, the last 2 years, has been expelling tens of thousands of Central Americans, Latin Americans, protecting, quote unquote, the U.S. southern border after this crisis of migration from Central America. Enrique Pena has been following the dictates from Washington very clearly in terms of economic policy, privatization, labor policy, the war on drugs, militarization of that. He's really a loyal servant to Washington. That's why he's so happy to meet with Trump or with Clinton or with anybody. He's not interested in really defending Mexican people in the North or the South or Mexican sovereignty, but really, playing second place to whoever happens to be the president or could be the president of the United States. So that's what explains why they got along so well and why this meeting yesterday was so smooth. It turns out that Pena Nieto might have actually want Trump to win. He was speaking even favorably of the wall opinions. He was saying, we want to work together with Trump or whoever be the president on strengthening border security to the north of Mexico and also to the south. So it really turns out these guys are on the same page. They're kindred spirits.
Yascha Mounk, is that how you read that visit by Trump to Mexico City on Wednesday?
Well, I mean, I can't speak directly to President Nieto and sort of Mexican policy. I think the important thing for us is that it's true that Trump is not a unique phenomenon. It's very easy to look at the ways in which he's sort of gauche and bizarre. He's sort of, if some kind of communist propaganda ministry had come to a cartoonist and said, come up with some kind of stereotype of a bad American, they would have come up with something like Donald Trump, right? Somebody who's extremely rich, but also clearly doesn't really care much about other people, who's larger than life, who just brags all of the time. And so it's easy to think of Trump as something uniquely American, sort of very different from other parts of the world. But what's happening at the moment is that a new form of political regime is coming into its own, where we see the rise of what political scientists are calling illiberal Democrats, people who are very much based on majority opinion and on the preferences of ordinary people, but who want to sacrifice the rights of minorities that they dislike. And in that sense, Trump is just the American version of Marine Le Pen in France. He's the American version of people like the Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. And he's the American version of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary. And so I think, I can't speak directly to whether or not Nieto is also part of that. I don't know Mexican politics that well. But we have to see this as a threat that goes well beyond this election, that's going to stay with the American political system well beyond 2016, and that's really threatening to come home to Europe in a very real way.
First of all, before I go to Bruno Gollnisch and ask him about this, let me ask you, Celestine Bolen, about Trump's visit to Mexico. Are you surprised about the invitation? Are you surprised at how things went down?
I mean, I think it was not a bad move on Trump's part. I mean, I think it was a very bad move on the president of Mexico's part. He tried for half an hour, Trump, to look very statesmanlike. He read a script that was coherent. It was in full sentences. And he had he talked about we need to cooperate. Things that everybody says when they're on foreign visits. Where he comes back into his own is when he crosses back into the United States and lets it rip. And that's what his supporters want to hear. So, he scored a little point as a kind of statesman-like figure who can talk to other leaders. He's not yet a leader, but he can pretend to be in the running. And but then when it's back home and it's getting the votes and touching the buttons and playing into people's fears and going for a demagogic, frankly, pitch, he's back in his own element.
Bruno Gollnisch, if Donald Trump is elected president of the United States, is he going to build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it?
I don't know. It's Mr. Trump. It will be to the American people to decide. But first of all, allow me to answer to what I heard. First, I think that the Mexican president was perfectly right when he decided to invite both main candidates to the presidents of the United States. It seems to me quite normal than Mexican authorities try to discuss, even if they do not agree with such candidate who could, at least one of them will be tomorrow the president of the United States of America, the most powerful nation in the world. And then, about the wall, I would say that as we at Front National, we do not intend to build any wall. We want to retain, to recover the possibility to decide freely who will come into our country, which is a problem of massive immigration. So you can say that the wall.
And does your party share the values of Donald Trump?
Well, we are consistent patriots, so we do not decide for others. If I were American, I would vote rather for Donald Trump than for Mrs. Clinton. But it is the American people to decide. And if Marine Le Pen becomes as I do hope, President of France, she will have to discuss with the President of the United States, whoever it be. But let me say that we are much more than about this wall problem between United States and Mexico. We are much more interested in some attitudes in foreign policy advocated by Mr. Trump, who seem to us that they're much more respectful of the national sovereignty of foreign countries than the previous American administrations, either Democrats or Republicans. For example, Mr. Trump considers that NATO is obsolete. We do agree with this. We do not see the interest of NATO. He wants to have better relationship with Russia. I think he's right. And he's against globalism. In this point, he is right too, in our opinion. And he doesn't support complete free trade treaties that are absolutely devastating for developed nation economies, and we do agree with that.
Yasha Monk, your reaction?
Yeah, may I just point out how absurd it is to say in one sentence that Mr. Trump and Ms. Le Pen both respect national sovereignty, and then in the next sentence to go on to say that we should be close to Russia, because that happens to be aligning the fact that the only time since the end of World War II that a country has invaded a sovereign nation in Europe is when Russia invaded and annexed part of Ukraine a couple of years ago. But it's very interesting that Mrs. Le Pen and Mr. Trump see eye to eye on this, because they actually do want a politics that is based on a quite naked pursuit of national self-interest. This goes beyond a sort of sovereigntism. It goes to a populist expression of the whims and the preferences of your own people. And one of the fears I have is that we're talking a lot about this rapprochement between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin. And, you know, they have the same character. They're like two bros going into a bar for a night out together. But you know that those two are more likely to come to blows than any others. They may be similar in character, they may get along, but once they've had a couple of drinks, they're likely to clash. And I think that if Mr. Trump did become president of the United States, in the long run, you could quite easily imagine him and Mr. Putin coming to a quite needless and dangerous conflict. So this idea that we either should not be critical of Putin and not use very important institutions like NATO in order to guarantee the sovereignty of nations like the Ukraine, or even the idea that somehow Mr. Trump is going to be good for world peace because he kowtows to Putin rhetorically at the moment. I think both of that is quite naive.
Celestine Bolin?
Yeah.
I mean, I think what's interesting about the Putin-Trump relationship, or, you know, their kind of nice words about each other, is that in some ways they are similar just in their manner of being politicians. I mean, Putin also has enjoyed being brash, being crude, being the sort of muscular sort of presence on the stage, throwing his body language around. And Trump obviously has no qualms about that either. And again, as I say, a sort of a vulgarity, which also, by the way, was shared by Berlusconi in Italy. I mean, I think there's a pattern to politicians that become popular because they seem to be saying it as it is, like you were saying, in a bros in a bar. Bros in a bar has a certain resonance among some parts of the electorate, and Putin has that kind of appeal back home as well.
John Ackerman, which way are politics going?
This is a very interesting discussion because as a Mexican, of course, I'm not going to defend Trump, but the idea that somehow the answer is to return to the smooth, hypocritical, neoliberal, globalist perspective, and that's going to save us from these brash, macho guys, is just a complete fantasy. This is what has created these brash figures like Trump and Marine Le Pen. And Enrique Pena Nieto in Mexico is the best example of it. He is a product of the smooth neoliberal sort of perspective on politics, and he is worse than Trump, or just as bad as Trump. That's why they get along so well. From our perspective in Latin America and Mexico, Hillary Clinton is just as bad as Trump. Of course, Obama has been the deporter-in-chief. Hillary Clinton's policies towards Latin America have been scandalous, supporting coups in Honduras, and supporting right-wing takeovers, the Obama administration in Venezuela, Brazil, all throughout South America. So Trump is, the other side of the coin of this very neoliberal politics. The idea that somehow there's this radical change when we need to just sort of hold on to the old way of doing politics is a really big mistake.
Yasha Monk,
it's very nice to see.
May I answer to what was told to me about Ukraine? I just consider that it is not necessary for us to be involved in this conflict. Everybody knows, when you know a little bit the history of Russia, that Ukraine was a core of Russian nation, that half of Ukrainians feel themselves as Russians, and that
but let me ask you more about what John Ackerman just said. Let me ask you, because he's approaching things from an anti-globalization perspective against neoliberal policies. Is your party siding with people who support the left-wing governments of Latin America?
Why not? If they are fighting for their independence and to recover their sovereignty, and to be free from the pressure of, for example, of international financial interests that have been sometimes devastating among these countries.
So the National Front supports, say, Venezuela's government?
Well, I don't know how it works now, but at least we weren't against Mr. Chavez. That's for sure. Well, if this government is deriving towards dictatorship, we will not support it. But anyway, we are not in charge. In France, for example, we are not in charge to rule the whole world. We have enough problems in our country, I believe. And what I find very surprising in this debate is that it seems that it seems that I am the only one to agree first to discuss with everybody. I mean, with every other nation, whatever be the regime, and to enter into negotiation. And what I hear that we must nearly go back to Cold War with Russia, extend, for example, NATO alliance, in spite of the fact that, for example, the Communist Warsaw Pact has been cancelled and wiped out, in spite of the fact that the Russians withdrew from East Europe that were previously dominated by Soviet Union, right, in spite of the fact that Soviet Union itself disappeared. And I never heard, for example, in the European Parliament, so many aggressive speeches against Russia that I never heard when it was a real menace at the time for the freedom of the
I guess I sort of feel like the parameters of the debate are slippery here, because I think if we're talking about Trump, one of the big problems is that we don't know what we're talking about. We don't know what his policies really would be. Just take the wall. I mean, he said in Mexico, we didn't talk about paying for it, and the next thing he's in Arizona, and again, whipping up a kind of frenzy among voters saying, and we'll make them pay. So which Trump? What policies would he pursue? Liberal, global, neoliberal globalization. I mean, I'm not quite sure, that anybody is really ready to sort of stop free trade. That's, maybe regulate it better, maybe put in better protections. But
yes. He's not against free trade.
All right, we're gonna pick up on these points. When we come back, stay with us. We're gonna have to take a very quick break. You're watching the France 24 debate.